Canada and the United States. I mean, Canada's promised considerable investment in ice-breaking capability, not delivered, and this takes a while to come online. I think the Russians are much more capable in that respect. On the Northern Sea route, it's actively used right now. The Northwest Passage, not so much. I think there's been a great diminution in probably 5 times by a factor of 5 in Northern Sea route use over the last year or year and a half since the Ukrainian conflict. But I think the Russians are very cognizant of that. I haven't heard of deliberate melting of the ice through the Northern Sea route, so I can't comment on that.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment, and then really if Admiral Papp wants to join, and you're the expert here on certainly the Arctic shipping, but my understanding is that even with the ice melt, the shipping conditions on both northern routes are still going to be very dangerous, very risky, subject to sudden weather changes and floating ice, if we all remember the Titanic. So it's not going to be, sailing down the Potomac River, on a Saturday. From everything I read, it's not going to, happen overnight. And Admiral Papp, if you'd like to join in, please.
Well, certainly, I think one of the first responsibilities of an Arctic nation is to make sure you have assured access. And even though predictions state that we may see an ice-free Arctic during the summer by mid-century, that's still almost 40 years away. And we are going to continue to have sea ice throughout the year, and then, of course, the winter ice. And as was demonstrated just maybe 4 years ago, an early freeze in the Bering Sea required us to send an icebreaker up to break into Nome to provide fuel to make sure that our citizens made it through the winter. So icebreakers are going to be a requirement. They're going to be necessary for a long time. And I need to remind everybody that we're talking about the Arctic a lot, but we're bipolar. We have other responsibilities in Antarctica. We need to break into McMurdo to resupply each year. And actually, it's been getting tougher each year to break into McMurdo. So icebreakers will be around for a while. And as I've stated publicly many times, the United States needs to be about the business of getting at least one new icebreaker built. There's conflicting opinions on how many we should have, but all of them talk about 6 or more. So it would seem to me we can at least agree on one, and hopefully we'll start moving forward on that soon. And as far as deliberate melting of the ice, I too have not heard that. And there's probably some small contribution of shipping that, whether it's through black carbon or gases put out by the ships operating out there, but really almost insignificant compared to the CO2 that's produced in the rest of the world. So I've got no concerns about icebreakers continuing to operate up there.
Yeah, this also may be our friends from Finland and other Scandinavian countries that are doing very well in icebreakers, put out the idea that this might be an area for international cooperation in terms of, an icebreaker fleet, and that's another possibility. But questions, please. Yes, down here.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Deanne Divis. I'm with Inside Unmanned Systems, and I want to ask about the impact of technology on the discussion that we're having today. We're seeing a rush to do research in the Arctic with drones, and they have promise for anticipating and making it easier to get through the ice. We also see automated, autonomous underwater systems that can get under the ice to inform science. Both of these kinds of efforts can inform oil exploration. So given that this is happening, I'm wondering, within the context of the importance of traveling through the ice, the importance of the resources, how the advent of this kind of technology might impact the discussion and the strategic back and forth that you've described.
Do you want to try that one?
Yeah, a very, very good question. For one, there are a variety of ways to answer this, but one of the major shortcomings, again, as I understand it, in the Arctic, is the lack of charts, sea charts, lack of really mapping, of the Arctic Ocean. I forgot the percentage of the area that has been mapped, but I think it's 10%. That figure may be wrong, but it is very, very small. And I think there's a key role, for technology and advanced, mapping technology using drones. Everything that you've described, I would hope, in improving, research and development, in that area. Another area that is so badly in need of, work is communications. The Arctic is a very, very large area, and communications are not, up to what they need to be. And I think that that's another area from the U.S. chairmanship, that is going to be, accentuated, is the need, to improve, communication. And if there's better understanding of where oil and gas are, I think that's all to the good, as well. That may actually improve the situation, because if the places, the sources, the size of of resources are known, and you remove some of the unknowns, that might help in terms of furthering negotiations if there are still undecided areas. So go to it, go for it. Rich.
Rich Koslerich from George Mason University. I agree on the energy front that really is out in your 40, 50-year scenario. But what strikes me in all this talk about shipping through the Northern Passage is not just the cost of icebreakers and facilities, but who's going to build essentially duplicate commercial capacity that would have to be of a different character than the container ships that now find another way between Europe and Asia, to use a route that is not going to be available 12 months of the year. And the question comes to my mind, simply on a cost-benefit point of view, would it be more significant to look at a land-based transportation system from China to Europe, call it the Silk Route, as a better, from a commercial point of view and maybe even from a geopolitical point of view, than all the talk about a very, very expensive proposition of operationalizing commercially the Arctic?
I think the Chinese are already doing that.
That's right.
The new Silk Road. I think they're investing huge amounts of money in Georgia and a lot of other places in doing that. And my guess, the Chinese are also extremely interested, in the Arctic. They're signing a number of agreements. They're now an observer state, at the Arctic Council. And it looks to me like they're doing what is very logical to them, is, one or two or three, possibilities. On the shipping side, again, I'm not an expert on this at all, but there is the International Maritime Organization, is completing a new Arctic shipping, a polar shipping code. And my guess is, that's going to bring in a bunch of new, again, Admiral Papp, I'm in your area, but we'll probably bring in a number of new requirements that are going to have to be met, by shippers, going up there. And I think that you're absolutely right. In terms of actual shipping in these northern sea routes, container ships, I'm told it will never be a go, because ships have to work on exact schedules, and given the weather conditions, it's never going to happen up there. So what you're going to have is oil and gas carriers, minerals, nickel, things of that nature, traversing, back and forth. And so as I say, no matter which way you look at it, I don't see over the near term that northern sea route's going to be a panacea. And as Erwin pointed out, on the northern sea route, the shipping, declined by a very significant amount. And I'm not sure, apparently it had something to do with Ukraine and flagging of ships, which I'm not sure I quite understand. But again, it's not huge at the present time. But please add. No.
Yeah, that's good.
John.
Thank you. John Farrell from the Arctic Research Commission. First, a comment to Ken. You're absolutely right that the oil and gas is in the EEZ. But a possible counter-argument to the PAC's position might be the number of maritime boundary disputes that are unresolved, including between U.S. and Russia, even U.S. and Canada. And it's been, interestingly, very quiet on that front in terms of resolving those. We heard about Norway and the 40-year discussion, and they drew the line down the middle, which I always find interesting. But two questions for Mr. Studin. One, and these are both of you could elaborate a little bit further. One is, how do you explain or justify an increase in Canadian population, a tripling essentially, from about 36 million now to 100 million? I didn't follow that. And then the second, I'm having trouble with your linkage that you talked about with Russia. And in particular, if I heard you correctly, you said conflict in Ukraine may be expressed through the Arctic. And when you talked about through it, your example seemed to talk about bombers coming over and bombing North American cities. I've always also had a little trouble with that. If you could expand on that, I'd appreciate that.
Well, let me start on the latter point. I'm not a military expert, but I think that it's obvious in the Russian strategic mind that if there were conflict with the West, Europe would be a target and North America would be a target. North American targeting would be through the north, through the Arctic. You might talk about ICBMs. I don't want to go beyond that. Seems pretty manifest to me, and it's open in the literature and political commentary and in the strategic mind of Russian, and it wasn't in the case of Soviet thinkers. It's not in the strategic minds of Canadian and North American thinkers. To my chagrin, because it would sharpen the urgency in respect of solving the conflict. On the Canadian point, 36 million to 100 million, medium-term projections for Canada towards the end of the century in the 70s or 80s, millions population. We're at 36, approaching 37 million today. We're highly underpopulated as a country given the territory, even in the south side. But to be meaningfully engaged in the north, we're going to have larger population centers in the north. And so I'm not suggesting that there will be planned cities in the north, but an increased population is not a controversial point in Canada. It's just the quantum that is a little bit astronomical, 100 million. But that's an active debate in Canada for a lot of domestic reasons, including institutional reasons today.
In the back. Yeah, yes, sir.
Hi, Rob Hammett from Johns Hopkins. I wanted to thank you for your remarks and was going to ask, you've been talking a lot about that the Arctic and its linkages with the Ukraine, and the conflict in Ukraine rather, and you mentioned that the Russians link the Arctic to other issues, and your recommendations for essentially avoiding conflict in the Arctic are resolve the Ukrainian crisis. And I was going to ask what your thoughts were if, God forbid, we're not able to do that, or this tension between the West and Russia continues into, say, the next decade. Does that mean there's no hope for the Arctic, or are we going to be able to keep these as a separate track issue? And even if we can't solve Ukraine, if we're able to keep the Arctic cold?
So a couple of things. My recommendation for solving the Ukraine thing is just a tactical moment in time. That is to say, it's an absurd conflict, and if we had a debate about the Ukraine conflict, I'd probably go, and I think into better detail than we've been able to with Ken about how it started, why it started. I think it's highly misunderstood here. But let me just go through a reasonable causality. One is that Ukrainian political incompetence over 23 years. Second cause, Russian disproportionality. Third cause, Western obliviousness. In that rank, okay? And we could talk about details and weights. In my assessment, the conflict should never have happened, and it can still be fixed such that historians at the end of the century, when Canada is at 100 million, look back and say this was just a tactical conflict, almost like the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, although that caused the Russian Revolution, but That's maybe not a good parallel. A tactical conflict in time, right? That leaves us the Pax Arctica thesis that Kenneth privileges, but leaves other moments, tactical moments, that could disrupt that larger Pax. So I've given my assessment of what would fix the conflict. I would put it to you that it's a highly credible algorithm. 1, 2, 3. To have any hope of fixing the, or of other tactical moments in time not hurting the prospects of the Pax Arctica, you need to create this larger institutional framework that underpins all the so-called transactional stuff that's under any chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And that is a Europe 2.0, Europe 3.0, and also I would say a vertical axis between Chiapas and Sochi. I don't know what that looks like. I've thought more about the Europe 3.0, as have the Europeans slowly but surely, and the Russians as well. So there is no foreordained conflict or Pax in the Arctica beyond 20 years. We're going to have to reinvent that architecture over time. But I think that the prospect of war or conflict, starting through the Arctic, as the gentleman was saying, I mean, the Russians would bomb through the Arctic. I mean, the rockets would go through the Arctic. I don't think we're talking about infantry in the first instance, right? I think these are highly reachable targets for Russian interests. But to prevent that, you would need to have that larger institutional infrastructure.
I just wanted to add one thing. I'm very, very much aware of Russian military activities, in and around the Arctic, maneuvers, overflights, buzzing of ships, things that are dangerous, uncalled for, and really need to stop. Other Russian efforts, to build infrastructure, in the north, repairing airfields, as we've discussed at length here today. Russia has major interest in the north and has obvious interest in defending those, building up its Coast Guard, building up its infrastructure as borders become more porous. All of that is very, very understandable. But what is not understandable and is very worrisome are the things that I just described, the buzzings, the needless efforts at confrontations, which could lead to the types of conflicts through an accident of some type that Erwin has talked about. David.
Thanks again. I'm David Bolton. I work at the Department of State, also on the Arctic Council Chairmanship. Question: have you given any thought to what the Arctic Council might evolve into? It's already evolved quite a lot in its not quite 20 years of history, but it's growing. And as you look out into the future of the Arctic, what role could it play, or what could it become, say, 20, 40, 60 years from now?
Thank you for the question, and much luck in your chairmanship again. I think one aspect that's neglected in the United States, certainly in Russia, but that is gaining increased momentum in Canada, actually. It has yet to manifest itself in Arctic terms, but 2 weeks ago there was a major report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that talked about the tenets of a new deal between the Aboriginal population of Canada, which is, as a proportion of the national population, much larger than in the United States. The tenets of a new deal for that based on past misdeeds and past, I don't want to say crimes, but bad policy decisions. What would that look like for the Arctic? There will certainly be Arctic tentacles, and I think Canada could be a leader in that respect in bringing that dialogue into the Arctic. And dare I say, to Kenneth's point, to be propitious to the idea of a Pax Arctica, increased Aboriginal both solidarity and participation would be a good thing, I think. So that I think is something to look for. In terms of strict membership of the Arctic Council, that's probably less interesting, I think, than that policy wave.
David, I would just add, I think, security has a lot of definitions, as we've talked about, and the Arctic Council deals, with, environmental security, a lot of other, the peoples of the North. But I do think with the Coast Guard Forum and other venues that could be available if the situation, in Ukraine becomes more manageable. In other words, dialogues between chiefs of staff of armies, of navies. I do think over time that, that the Arctic Council could either directly or indirectly be a forum to discuss more sort of traditional security issues. We're certainly not there yet, and I know there's a lot of opposition to that. But given the lack of such dialogue right now and the venues for such dialogue, I do think that the Arctic could be a place in the future. That's just my own viewpoint. We still have time for more questions. Yes, sir.
Firstly, I wanted to thank you gentlemen for being here today, as well as Admiral Papp. My name is Dak Paluk, a U.S. Army officer, and I'm currently attending Georgetown doing postgraduate work.
Great.
Ambassador Yelovitz, you touched upon this with Russian military provocations, with bombers and long-range interceptors probing airspace, compelling NORAD to react. Russians have also recently responded to the Norwegian-led Arctic Challenge exercise 2015 with their own fighters conducting maneuvers. We talked about how these military provocations are counterproductive, and quite honestly, strategically and for the further development of the Arctic, it's within Russia's best interest to actually cooperate with everybody. Of course, these are all logical, but then what exactly is Putin getting at? Why do they continue to do this? Is this just a manifestation of Ukraine, or are there other factors involved as well? Thank you.
Do you want to? No, I'll join in, but please
Well,
go
it
first.
kind of teed me up for something I wanted to say.
Good.
First of all, thank you for the question. And my wife and I spent the weekend in and around Georgetown. It's the second or third time I've been there. I want to send my kid to that university. So
Good.
flag that program that you're taking.
We'll take them.
The causality of the conflict. Frankly, I think I mentioned the causality of the conflict in the following order. And let me ascribe weights now to them. Ukrainian political incompetence, Russian disproportionality, Western obliviousness. 50%, 25%, 25%. It starts as an intra-Ukrainian conflict. Let me just repeat that. Intra-Ukrainian conflict. And notwithstanding Russian support for the rebels in the Donbass, it remains an intra-Ukrainian conflict. And even once the peace is settled with Russia, my hope, because that's a strategic question, there will remain an intra-Ukrainian conflict, which I think is misunderstood here. There was a revolution, right? Don't forget there was an American revolution, there was a counter-revolution. The people that spearheaded the revolution, notwithstanding the very legitimate protests in the Maidan, many of whom were my students, peaceful protests. I saw on their Facebook posts, off to the Maidan, because we want to Europe, we want to Europe, into Europe, which is a symbol, not an institution. The counter-revolution was from people in the Donbass, in Odessa, in Kharkov, who could not make it to Kiev, who were apolitical and who said, what the hell just happened? Right? They just needed support and a provocation to get their act together. They were largely passive. They probably would have accepted a new government that had largely civilian tenets, but there were active militias that put the revolution, that broke the camel's back, as it were. And Russia, which knows, dare I say, Ukraine 100 times better than we do in the West. Even Canada, which we keep saying in Canada that we have the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world. We're mistaken. Russia's Ukrainian diaspora is 25 times larger than ours, and it's a fresh diaspora. So we don't need to tell Russia what's happening in Ukraine. Russia is not angelic in this conflict, but is responding to a certain dynamic. In my view, Ukrainian incompetence was pushed towards a binary choice between Europe and Russia too aggressively at a point when they hadn't built sufficient institutions to bind the contradictions between East and West over the course of their 23 years. Right? Russia was not a great helper in that, and the West knew not about anything about Ukraine. What do they know about Ukraine? What do we still know about Ukraine? Well, there's a revolution, there's a counter-revolution. Right? And Russia, in my view, had to make a move of some manifestation in response to the revolution. The point about disproportionality is, did they have to annex Ukraine? Crimea, right? That's a policy point, right? Whether they needed to make a move is uncontroversial. The problem is that the Crimean annexation changed the whole logic of the conflict and provoked the West into only seeing Russia as the actor and forgetting that there was an entire Ukrainian dynamic that had yet to be solved. But there are militias fighting against militias. There is at the core of the Donbass rebellion what I call a security dilemma that the Minsk Accords cannot solve. That is, one side, militias and Ukrainian army, fancy that as soon as they withdraw, the other side will claim that territory, and the reverse. There are no angels. They're often the same people, Russian speaking in many cases, same mentality. They're just fighting for different sides. The West's interest is to be less in the morality play mode and to fix it clinically as a strategic crisis in the global order. That's what I would say on the provocation side. So from the Russian perspective, the first provocation is that the revolution happened and it was legitimated by the West, which it was.
On the causality side, I would probably flip the proportions. I agree, the Ukrainians bear great responsibility, but the fact that there are 500, Russian tanks, in Ukraine right now, and God knows how many armored personnel carriers, how many Russian troops, the shooting down of that Malaysian aircraft. I mean, there are a whole series of events that would not have happened had not, a direct Russian intervention take place here. So as I say, I think I would argue a bit on the causality side proportion. But to your point, I think a lot of these provocations are part of Mr. Putin's worldview, and his worldview right now is that, that the West is threatening Russia, that we want to cause regime change there, that there's a great concern about color revolutions. I think this has been clear from all the actions against NGOs and cutting off of a whole variety of foreign influences, into Russia. And as I say, I think a part of these provocations, is to demonstrate, again, this is a country, that either correctly or indirectly feels that it was, dissed by the West, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Certainly they have arguments, but I think that, it's way disproportional to what they're doing. And the effort, I think, on Mr. Putin's part very much is that Russia is going to be regarded as a world player. As you said earlier, the Russians are going to be part of every problem and every solution, in the Arctic and a lot of other world issues. And unfortunately, he's using this way, the negative, the demonstrations of military capability to underline that point. But I think it's part of a worldview that is very prevalent right now, from Mr. Putin and the Kremlin. So I think, do we have time for one more? Okay. Right here, sir.
Great, thank you so much. My name is David Wishart. I'm from the University of Washington out in Seattle. I guess I have a question that kind of ties together what a lot of folks have been saying. But insofar as the only way to really cooperatively govern the Arctic or even use it from a commercial perspective requires institutional trust, I wonder, is there really much hope for things like technology and science exchange if there is so much underlying distrust between countries like the US and Russia, perhaps Russia and Canada to a certain extent? I was at NOAA in Seattle, and they were showing me this ecosystem services GIS they're putting together, and they're exchanging data across from the US to Canada to Norway, and 40%-ish of their map of the Arctic lacks any data from Russia because they just have no access, and there's no exchange of that kind of intel. So I wonder, what is the most important technology that we need to exchange? And in the short term, where are the hopes going to come from of that kind of institutional openness?
I think that's a fundamental question. May I survey the room and ask how many people working in the Arctic speak Russian? I would say the first technology is language competence.
Good point.
And that is an old diplomatic skill, which is manifestly absent today in English-speaking countries. It's a Canadian problem. It's an English problem in the UK, which speaks to the decline of their diplomatic force. The second one, the second technology is a vodka glass. It's very serious, which is to say that the only way the trust can be built is not through a 21st century technological narrative or lens. That will solve some technical problems, but the underlying ones will be fostered and accelerated through breaking bread. So I've been shocked through the course of the Ukrainian conflict, and now as we accelerate into the end of the Obama term, talk about other ones, at how little we know one another, and how educated people who are educated at some of the best universities are speaking at complete cross purposes in different languages and are convinced of their own rightness, but don't have a Rolodex in the other country, don't read the literature of the other country. Everyone thinks that they're reading the New York Times or the Economist and they've got all the facts. You should read Global Brief, by the way, it's a great magazine. But the Russians have a different psyche. They're young people. I remember our own Prime Minister, Harper, he said, I've been to Russia. I've spoken to their young people. They want the same thing out of life that we do. He's gravely mistaken. Of course they want the same thing out of life in basic material, in a basic material sense, but the psychology is very different. Even though the garb might be the same, the education in some cases might be the same. But we need to understand each other differently. So listen to Putin's speeches. Listen to Yanukovych's speech, listen to Poroshenko's speech in their languages, which is important. You'd be shocked that 90% of what they say for their own audiences is sensible. It's only because we don't understand the local context, the culture, the mentality, the psychology that we look at it either as a lie or nonsense and as incredible. And they the reverse. And it's amazing that we are at dialogue des sourds, dialogue des aveugles, that can result in absurd conflict very quickly, yeah, but this time with really grave consequences. So the technology point second, the human point first.
I completely agree. I would add two things. One, this is where the Arctic Council, I think, plays a very important role. The working groups of the Arctic Council are doing exactly, that type of technological, scientific, environmental work, and I think, to the best of my knowledge, that is still going on, rather well. It doesn't get the headlines, but I think it's doing a good job. The second thing, given you're from Washington, the University of Washington, I've written separately about the horrible decline in Russian studies, in this country, the lack of funding, which to me is a grievous sin at this particular juncture. I couldn't agree more. We need to understand Russia a lot better. We need a generation of new young scholars and government officials, who, live, breathe, and smell Russia, who've been there and can really advise on policy and write the research and analysis, that we need for the future. And it's just a crime to me that these programs are being cut, right now. But what can we do? Still deal it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for a very, very thought-provoking and discussion. Lots to think about there, lots to move forward on. On this last point, talking about people, our next program will be end of July, looking at human and economic security in a federal system, looking at Canada, the United States, and perhaps another one. So stay tuned for that. More information out there. There's a lot on our website. Some of the publications that are there, we didn't print them up, but you can pull them down on our website. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your great questions, and we'll see you again soon, I hope. Have a great day.
Terrific. I really enjoyed that.